Chapter 1. Victoria Vance, the eldest daughter of the ultra-wealthy Vance family, was getting engaged. Her fiancé was Tristan Thorne, the bitter rival of her adopted younger brother, Julian Vance. At the New Year's Eve family dinner, she announced the news to everyone. The entire family stared nervously at Julian, terrified he would flip the dining table on the spot. After all, Julian's love for Victoria was dangerously obsessive. He had sabotaged 30 of her blind dates, thrown red wine on a male secretary who confessed his feelings to her, and had a front desk clerk banished to a suburban warehouse just because Victoria had glanced at him a second longer than necessary. Yet, Julian simply offered a velvet box. The box clicked open to reveal a pair of natural blue diamonds. The clarity was flawless, shimmering with a brilliant, flowing light under the chandelier. Eleanor, their mother, froze for a moment. "Julian, these diamonds are worth $200 million. You emptied your entire trust fund just to buy them. Weren't you planning to have them set into a wedding ring, and then propose to Victoria?" Eleanor stopped herself, but Julian silently finished her unspoken sentence in his mind. He wore a generous, perfectly composed smile on his face, his tone utterly sincere. "I was originally going to give them to Victoria anyway. They make a perfect engagement gift for my sister and my future brother-in-law." At these words, Victoria frowned slightly. She scrutinized Julian's expression for a moment before speaking, her tone betraying neither joy nor anger. "I'll accept my brother's kind gesture on Tristan's behalf." After dinner, she called Julian alone into the study. She lit a slim cigarette, holding it between her fingers. Her innate elegance and the oppressive aura of someone accustomed to absolute power washed over him, making it hard to breathe. "Julian, you've graduated now. I'm planning to send you to take over our subsidiary in Milwaukee." She paused. "It's a film production company. Just what you like. You'll officially take the position in half a month." Half a month from now was also the exact date of her official engagement party with Tristan Thorne. Sending Julian away to manage a subsidiary was just an excuse to get him out of the picture, ensuring he wouldn't ruin their engagement. Julian looked at the face he had been hopelessly infatuated with for over a decade. The smooth contours, the striking, elegant eyes. He could trace them with his eyes closed. He lowered his gaze and said softly, "Okay, by his old standards, he should be throwing a tantrum. He should have red eyes and be demanding to know what right Victoria had to send him away." He would have thrown caution to the wind, rushed forward to hold her, and pleaded, "Victoria, please don't abandon me." But he was acting so incredibly obedient, as if he had never harbored any desires for her beyond a purely platonic sibling bond. A sudden, inexplicable discomfort twisted in Victoria's chest. Unable to pinpoint the cause, she could only assume he was faking his good behavior while plotting something disastrous. She crushed her cigarette out, her tone half warning, half coaxing. "Julian, I have always treated you as my own flesh and blood. When you were younger, if you acted out, I let it slide. I spoiled you. But if you cause trouble going forward, I won't let you off easy. Milwaukee isn't far. You can come back whenever you want. The subsidiary is full of young directors and actors. You can have your pick of talented, beautiful women. Stop keeping your eyes fixated solely on me." Julian secretly clenched his fists and forced a bright smile. "You're right, Victoria. I'll definitely pick someone great. I won't let your good intentions go to waste." Victoria frowned, feeling that something was deeply off, when her phone suddenly rang. It was Tristan, urging her to come out and watch the New Year's Eve fireworks with him. Victoria grabbed her coat and headed for the door, but just before leaving, she hesitated and looked back at Julian. "Julian, do you want to come along?" Julian froze. He remembered how he had once forced Victoria to promise him that she would watch the fireworks and wait for the midnight ball drop with him every single year. He shook his head, his tone light and urging. "You should go, Victoria. Have fun with Tristan." Victoria stared at him for 2 full seconds before finally leaving without another word. The moment the door clicked shut, the slight smile on Julian's lips finally collapsed. He forced himself to pull it together and went to find Eleanor. When Eleanor saw him, a flash of pity crossed her eyes. "Julian, if it hurts, just cry. Victoria has spoiled you in every way since you were little. It's only human nature that you fell in love with her. But Victoria has always been groomed as the heir. She carries a heavy burden of responsibility. She thinks marrying you would ruin your reputation and get you crucified by our social circle. If you really can't let her go, Mom can go talk to her for you." Julian smiled bitterly and shook his head. Nobody knew that he had been reborn. In his past life, relying on his mother's support, he had relentlessly stalked and harassed Victoria. He had thrown tantrums, cried, and threatened his own life until he wore down Victoria's resolve. Ultimately, she broke up with Tristan and married him. But on the day of their wedding, Tristan had burst in wearing a black suit, pointing his finger right at Julian's nose and screaming that he was a homewrecker who stole his woman. Julian had argued back, but his words were taken out of context and posted online. The public backlash was entirely one-sided, slamming him as a shameless deviant who seduced his sister, completely ignoring morality and destroying the family's honor. The Vance family's stock plummeted in the fallout. His father, Richard Vance, suffered a fatal stroke from the sheer rage of it all. At the funeral, Eleanor's doting affection for Julian vanished entirely. She looked at him as if he were an enemy. The Thorne and Vance families went from lifelong allies to mortal enemies, fighting viciously in the business world. Victoria was overwhelmed, stretched to her breaking point, and found herself spending more and more time across the negotiation table from Tristan. She started coming home later and later. Julian didn't dare make a fuss anymore. They fought once, and Victoria didn't come home for 3 days. In that massive, empty mansion, he lived like a condemned sinner. Later, Victoria brought up divorce. Her tone was overflowing with exhaustion and regret. If I just insisted on marrying Tristan back then, Dad wouldn't be dead. Mom wouldn't be like this, and the Vance family wouldn't have ended up in this state. Julian had nothing to say in his defense. He signed the papers in absolute silence. When he walked out of the lawyer's office, he was completely out of it. He was struck and sent flying by a cargo truck running a red light. The very last image he saw before he died was Victoria standing on the opposite side of the street, answering a call from Tristan, not even glancing in his direction. His selfish stubbornness had destroyed the lives of several people. Thinking of this, Julian suddenly dropped to his knees and gave Eleanor a deep, formal bow of absolute respect and submission. Eleanor jumped in shock and quickly tried to pull him up. "Child, what are you doing?" Julian's expression was solemn. "The Vance family has raised me for 20 years. I remember that debt, and I don't dare wish for anything more. I heard the family has been trying to partner with the Sterling family over in London, but we haven't found a way in. I'm willing to enter an arranged marriage with the Sterling's youngest daughter. You want to marry Morgan Sterling?" Eleanor's face drained of color as she gripped Julian's wrist tightly. "Julian, do you know who Morgan is? Rumor has it she inherited her biological mother's severe mental illness. She's a dark, violent psychopath who spent her childhood locked in an asylum, and she's supposedly responsible for the deaths of her 2 older sisters. You'd be throwing yourself straight into a fire pit." Julian didn't pull his hand away. He softened his voice to soothe her. "Mom, those are just rumors. Besides, don't other people think I'm crazy too? Crazy enough to ignore basic ethics and fall in love with my sister. So domineering and selfish that I try to chase away every man near her, turning the Vance house completely upside down. The Sterlings are one of the most powerful old money families in our global circle, yet they operate entirely in the shadows. Marriage is the only chance we have to connect with them. You and Dad spoiled me so much. I want to do something to contribute to this family." He analyzed the pros and cons of the marriage alliance, his eyes growing more resolute with every word. Eleanor's eyes grew red. She looked at him for a long time before finally reaching out to stroke his hair. "All right, since your mind is made up, the Sterlings will send someone to pick you up. The wedding will be held in London in half a month." Half a month. Hearing that timeline, Julian sighed internally at the irony. His wedding in this lifetime was going to be on the exact same day as Victoria's engagement party. In his past life, his selfish delusions had ruined everyone. So after being reborn, he only had 2 goals. First, to stay far away from Victoria and sever their romantic ties. Second, to atone for his sins and repay his debt to the Vance family. Hopefully, this time, Victoria wouldn't have any regrets because of him. Eleanor suddenly remembered something and began to fuss. "The date the Sterlings set is far too rushed. I haven't even had time to prepare anything for you. Here's what we'll do. I'll have Victoria transfer some of the company's shares to you first." "Mom, don't. I don't need anything." Julian quickly interrupted her, resting his head on her knee. "Also, please help me keep the marriage a secret from Victoria for now. I don't want her to think I'm doing this to force her to make a choice or use it to block her engagement to Tristan." Unable to dissuade him, Eleanor sighed and pulled him into a hug, patting his back just like she did when he was little, agreeing to all his requests. Mother and son leaned against each other and talked for a long time. By the time Julian returned to his room, the sky was already starting to lighten, yet he felt no sleepiness. He leaned against the door and scanned his room. An entire wall was covered with photos of him and Victoria. His closet was packed with haute couture suits Victoria had bought for him when she dragged him to Fashion Week. The bookshelves were lined with birthday gifts she had given him over the years. Every corner was saturated with traces of Victoria, representing the past 20 years of his life. He was originally just an abandoned baby, It was Victoria, who had wanted a younger brother and brought the 3-year-old him back to the Vance family from an orphanage. At first, he had huddled in a corner, too terrified to move. Victoria had handed him a piece of candy, taken his hand, and given him a warm, radiant smile. "Don't be afraid. From now on, I'm your big sister. I will always protect you." Chapter 2 later, she had kept her word. She attended Julian's parent-teacher conferences, shielded him from drunken thugs looking for a fight, and stayed up all night by his side when he ran a fever. She fulfilled every duty a sister could possibly have. It was he who had been too greedy. He wasn't satisfied with just being a brother. He harbored the delusional hope of monopolizing all of Victoria's affection forever. Julian shook his head, thoroughly disgusted with himself, and took one last lingering look at every corner of the room. Then, piece by piece, he took everything that might fuel his dangerous obsession and packed them into boxes, shoving them into the highest storage spaces. This process took another 2 hours, and sheer exhaustion finally hit him. Julian collapsed onto his bed in a dizzy haze. The very last thing he did before falling asleep was pull out his phone and book an expedited passport renewal for his trip to London. But he hadn't slept long before he hazily sensed a figure standing by his bed. Forcing his eyes open, his pupils suddenly contracted. Victoria stood there with a dark expression, scrolling through something on his phone. Realizing he was awake, she looked down at him, her voice freezing cold. "Julian, what exactly did you do last night?" Julian's brain buzzed, his sleepiness instantly vanishing. What had she seen? Did she know he was going to London for an arranged marriage? Before his sluggish brain could come up with an excuse, Victoria tossed the phone back onto his chest, suppressing her fury. "I knew it. I knew you wouldn't give up so easily. But I never imagined you'd be despicable enough to spread malicious rumors about Tristan online." Julian was entirely bewildered by the sudden scolding. Utterly confused, he picked up his phone. On the screen was an exposé posted by a notorious gossip blog, detailing Tristan's dark history, bullying a classmate until they dropped out, using his family background to steal first place in a photography contest, poaching other people's girlfriends, hitting up nightclubs with young models. The post already had over 10,000 comments, all tearing Tristan apart. The top-voted comment read, "With trash character like this, does he really think he's good enough for the Vance family's eldest daughter? If he has any self-awareness, he should cancel the engagement immediately." Julian took a deep breath, looking up with a clear, open gaze. "I didn't do this. If not you, then who?" Victoria looked down at him, staring right into his eyes. "Julian, you've hated Tristan since you were kids. You love competing with him over everything. If I recall correctly, you were originally supposed to win first place in that photography contest mentioned in the leak." Julian pressed his lips together. "Yes. At the time, I wanted to expose him for bribing the judges. But you promised to take me back to Iceland for another photography trip, so I stopped caring enough to fight him over it a long time ago." Victoria scoffed coldly. "Exactly. You like me, so you'll compromise on anything for my sake, but you'll also stoop to any underhanded tactic to target my fiancé." A wave of exhaustion washed over Julian. He said quietly, "But I really don't like you anymore." Before he could finish the sentence, the bedroom door was shoved open violently. Tristan stormed in, trembling all over, his voice cracking. "Julian, are you happy now? My phone is blowing up with nonstop harassment and death threats. You just don't want me to be with your sister, right? Fine. I'll call off the engagement. Just stop coming after me, please." Victoria quickly pulled him close, looking up and comforting him with a few soft words. When she turned back to Julian, her eyes were completely dead. "Julian, if you still want me to acknowledge you as my brother, you will post a public clarification right now and admit that you were the one spreading these rumors to smear Tristan." Julian's face went instantly pale. If he did that, the entire internet mob would turn their wrath onto him. Remembering the horrific experience of being cyberbullied and harassed in his past life, he gritted his teeth. "I won't admit to something I didn't do." Then, without waiting for Victoria to react, he got out of bed barefoot and dragged out the large box he had packed the night before. He opened it. Right on top was the very first photo he had taken with Victoria after arriving at the Vance estate. His voice was quiet, but every word was painfully clear. "If I prove to you that I don't have feelings for you anymore, will that prove I didn't do this?" As soon as he finished speaking, he picked up the framed photo and ripped it into pieces. Victoria's expression changed. Julian didn't even look at her. He picked up the next item, a bespoke haute couture suit she had given him for his 18th birthday. He took a pair of scissors to it. The sound of tearing silk was ear-piercing. One item after another. Photos, gifts, souvenirs. Every single piece was etched with his once obsessive, fanatical love. Things he had once treated as absolute treasures, he now destroyed without blinking. Victoria's frown deepened. A wave of inexplicable, chaotic irritation surged in her chest. She stepped forward and pinned Julian's wrist down. Julian, that's enough. Her hand was burning hot, her grip bruising. Julian looked up at her, his eyes dead and unmoving. In the tense standoff, Tristan's eyes darkened briefly before he forced a smile. Julian, is this really necessary? You're making it look like I'm the one aggressively backing you into a corner. He tugged gently on Victoria's sleeve, his voice sickeningly sweet. Let it go, Victoria. Don't force him. Even if he really did do it, as his future brother-in-law, what can I forgive? We need to get along in the future. Julian didn't have the energy to listen to his passive-aggressive, fake nice act. His tone was stiff as he kicked him out. Is there anything else you need, Victoria? Tristan? If not, I'd like to get some rest. Victoria looked at him, wanting to say something but stopping herself. Tristan pulled her sleeve again. Victoria, let's just go. Let Julian get some rest. Victoria nodded and turned to walk out. Julian walked them to the door. Just as he was about to shut it, a woman clutching a fruit knife suddenly sprinted straight toward the three of them. Tristan Thorne, you bastard. You drove my brother to drop out and kill himself. I'm going to make you pay with your life. Victoria reacted with lightning speed. She grabbed Tristan by the waist, shielding him as she twisted out of the way. But Julian, standing right behind her, had no time to dodge. Caught in the momentum of her spinning to protect Tristan, Julian was thrown directly into the path of the blade. SHHHK. The blade sank deep into Julian's chest. As it was ripped free, a sudden, horrifying warmth flooded his shirt, painting the fabric crimson. His legs gave out, and he slid down against the doorframe. In the chaos, he lifted his head. Through a hazy, blood-tinted field of vision, he saw the shock and a trace of remorse on Victoria's face. Tristan was cowering next to her, screaming. Bodyguards rushed in and pinned the attacker to the floor. Victoria's lips moved. It looked like she screamed his name. But Julian couldn't hear anything anymore. Darkness swallowed him whole. When he opened his eyes again, he was met with blinding fluorescent lights and the stark smell of antiseptic. You're awake? Eleanor's voice was choked with sobs. Julian, you terrified me to death. Julian weakly twitched his fingers. He was about to speak when he heard Eleanor turn toward the foot of the bed and start scolding. Victoria, I don't want to lecture you. And yes, it wasn't wrong to protect Tristan, but you should have looked behind you. Julian was standing right there. Your spin practically fed him straight to the knife. And before that, you insisted Julian was the one who smeared Tristan, storming into his room first thing in the morning to interrogate him. Let me tell you, Julian spent all of New Year's Eve talking with me. He didn't go back to his room until dawn. When exactly would he have had the time to orchestrate all that? Eleanor grew angrier as she spoke. For the sake of this family, he's even willing to— Mom, realizing Eleanor was about to spill the secret of the arranged marriage, Julian used every ounce of strength he had left to interrupt her. Eleanor rushed to his side. Julian, you're awake? What hurts? Let me get the doctor. I'm Fine. Julian managed a weak smile. Mom, don't worry. After a flurry of activity, the doctor checked him over and declared that there was no major danger. He had just lost a lot of blood and needed bed rest. Eleanor finally breathed a sigh of relief. After giving him a few more instructions, Julian convinced her to go buy some food. The hospital room fell silent. Julian looked at Victoria, who was still standing at the foot of the bed. His tone was entirely flat. Why are you still here, Victoria? Shouldn't you go keep Tristan company? He must be traumatized. Victoria frowned slightly. In the past, if Julian suffered even a minor scrape, he would exaggerate his pain, whining and clinging to her, demanding to be held and coddled. Now he just offered a cold, dismissive remark, essentially kicking her out. Regardless of everything else, you are still my brother. She took 2 steps closer, her voice low. Julian, you still have the right to tell me when you're in pain. Julian lowered his eyes. No thanks. I wouldn't want Tristan to misunderstand. You. Victoria wanted to say more, but his distant, alienated attitude pierced her, stirring up a wave of chaotic frustration. She pressed her lips together, turned around, and left. The moment the door closed, a nameless, inexplicable panic surged from the depths of her heart, which she forcefully suppressed. For the few days he was in the hospital, Julian was so quiet it was as if he were a completely different person. He received his expedited passport. Looking at his own photo on the document, he let out a soft breath. On the day he was discharged, Victoria came to pick him up, but the car didn't head back to the Vance estate. Tristan wants to treat you to dinner to apologize for misunderstanding you the other day. Victoria kept her eyes on the road. He wants to build a good relationship with you. Julian was silent for 2 seconds before nodding. Fine. When they arrived at the restaurant, Tristan was already there. Chapter 3, sitting next to him, was a young woman in an elegant dress, strikingly beautiful. Julian's here. Tristan greeted him with exaggerated enthusiasm. Seat. This is Chloe Carmichael, the second daughter of Carmichael Enterprises. She's always thought very highly of you. He smiled and introduced them. Chloe studied film too, so you two have a lot in common. I figured if you spent some time together, maybe something could spark between you. Victoria nodded in agreement. Tristan is right. It's good for you to make more friends. Julian looked at Chloe Carmichael, his heart sinking. This woman had pursued him before, and he had explicitly rejected her. Everyone in their social circle knew she was notoriously promiscuous, changing boyfriends faster than she changed clothes. Thank you for the thought, Tristan. He declined politely, but I'm not really looking for that right now. Tristan's smile stiffened for a second before he smoothly replied in a gentle tone. Julian, you can't keep relying on your sister like this. Victoria chimed in. We're not saying you have to date her, but if there are film projects in the future, you could at least discuss potential collaborations. Cornered like this, Julian found it hard to refuse. He just wanted to survive in peace until his departure for the wedding. He didn't want any unnecessary drama. Chloe seized the opportunity. Mr. Vance, I actually own a private lounge nearby. The atmosphere is lovely. Why don't we head over there to chat in detail? Julian glanced at Victoria. Her eyes were encouraging. He had no choice but to nod. The lighting in the lounge was dim and suggestive. Chloe ordered 2 drinks and slid one over to him. Mr. Vance, honestly, I've always admired you. She kept rambling. Julian gave half-hearted responses, but gradually, he started feeling dizzy. His vision blurred, and his limbs grew frighteningly weak. Something was wrong. He abruptly tried to stand, but his legs were so weak he could barely keep his balance. Chloe dropped her act, a vulgar smile spreading across her face. The drugs are kicking in, aren't they? Don't worry. I'll take very good care of you. She pulled out a leather belt, snapping it in the air. I absolutely love men who play hard to get. You'd better scream for me later. Julian was shoved back onto the sofa. The drugs made his consciousness drift in and out of focus. Chloe snapped the belt, her face twisted with perverse excitement. You know what? I despise men who act all pure and untouchable like you. You were pretty damn arrogant when you rejected me last time, weren't you? The belt cracked against the back of the sofa with a muffled thud. Julian bit the tip of his tongue hard, using the sharp pain to force himself awake. He secretly reached toward the coffee table, his fingertips grazing the cold glass of a vase. Today, I'm going to teach you. Before Chloe could finish her sentence, Julian gathered every ounce of strength he had left, grabbed the heavy vase, and brought it down violently onto her head. Crash! The porcelain shattered. Chloe collapsed to the floor instantly. Julian scrambled up, stumbling and dragging himself out of the lounge. The freezing night wind hit his collar. With shaking hands, he flagged down a taxi. By the time he made it back to the mansion, he was practically crawling through the door. But waiting to greet him was Tristan's triumphant stare and a piece of security footage. In the video, Chloe Carmichael lay in a pool of blood, while Julian's frantic, fleeing figure was clearly captured on camera. Julian, Tristan sighed heavily. If you didn't like the match I set up for you, you could have just said so. Was it really necessary to get violent? Victoria stood to the side, her face dark as a storm cloud. Mrs. Carmichael had already arrived, radiating fury. The Vance family must answer for this. We've already called the police. Assault with a deadly weapon is enough to put him in prison for years. Julian desperately tried to explain. She drugged me. It was self-defense. Drug you? Mrs. Carmichael sneered. My daughter can have any man she wants. Why would she need to drug you? It's obvious you're just an arrogant, violent brat who treats lives like garbage. Tristan softly intervened. Julian, just apologize. I'll go to the Carmichaels and beg for their mercy. Enough. Victoria cut him off. Her glare at Julian was utterly terrifying. A son of the Vance family cannot be dragged into a police station. The damage to our reputation would be catastrophic. She paused, enunciating every word. I will handle his discipline personally, the old-fashioned way. Julian's pupils shrank. Victoria, you don't believe me? Victoria didn't answer. She merely instructed a maid to fetch her riding crop. That woman has come after me before. Julian pointed a shaking finger at Tristan. He knows. He set us up on purpose. He planned all of this. Tristan's eyes welled up with tears. Julian, how can you falsely accuse me like this? I try to do something nice and introduce you to someone. Not only do you assault her, but you also throw dirty water on me. Enough. Victoria cut in again. It is exactly because I am your sister, because I protected you growing up and spoiled you until you thought you were above the law, that I need to teach you a real lesson. She took the riding crop from the maid and looked at Julian. Hold out your hands. Julian looked at her. He looked at the face he had loved for over a decade, and suddenly, he smiled. It was a bleak, desolate smile. He slowly held out his hands. Crack! The first strike of the riding crop fell, the stiff leather biting into his pale palms, instantly raising angry welts of blood. Julian trembled violently, clenching his jaw. Crack! The second strike. Crack! The third. Every single lash felt like it was whipping his heart, tearing his years of foolish devotion and pathetic fantasies into unrecognizable shreds. By the 10th strike, his palms were a ruin of torn skin and raw agony. Julian was deathly pale, cold sweat soaking through his shirt. Lock him in the basement storage room. Victoria tossed the crop aside. No one is allowed to let him out without my permission. The basement was freezing, pitch black, and piled high with dusty junk. Julian curled up in a corner, his entire body burning with agony. The knife wound from a few days ago hadn't fully healed, and the open wounds from the whip were already becoming inflamed. Worse, the drugs in his system hadn't fully worn off. He felt like his blood was on fire. He used his last bit of strength to pound frantically on the heavy door, screaming with a shredded voice, "Please, get a doctor. At least give me some medicine." A maid's voice drifted through the door, sounding conflicted. "Mr. Julian, please don't make this hard for us." Miss Victoria said that Mr. Thorne is in charge of the house now. Mr. Thorne ordered that you need to truly suffer this time, so you learn your lesson. Julian slid down the door and collapsed onto the floor. His parents were out of town visiting relatives for the holidays. There was no one in this house who could save him. On the first day, he received only a glass of water and half a cold roll of bread. On the second day, still just water. The bread had gone sour. By the third day, he was delirious with fever. Yet, the idle gossip of the maids constantly filtered through the crack in the door. Miss Victoria is treating Mr. Thorne so well. She's personally overseeing every single detail of the engagement party. I heard she reviewed every single invitation by hand. Absolutely. The wedding rings feature custom-cut gemstones. The banquet hall is completely flooded with Mr. Thorne's favorite roses, and she even hired a full symphony orchestra. The Vance family has never thrown an event this extravagant, right? Never. Miss Victoria is truly putting her heart into this. Julian listened in a delirious haze, thinking back to his wedding with Victoria in his past life. The rushed, careless itinerary, the sloppy decorations, the guests whispering and pointing, and Victoria's freezing, apathetic expression through the entire ceremony. So, this is what it looked like when she actually loved someone. Everything he had fought so desperately for in his past life had been nothing but a cruel joke. After 3 days, the door finally opened. The sunlight blinded him. An assistant stood in the doorway, reciting with zero emotion. "Miss Victoria wants me to take you to the Milwaukee subsidiary. We leave right now." Julian used the wall to pull himself up. His body screamed in pain as if his bones had been shattered. His voice was a dry rasp. "Can I take a shower first?" Seeing his wretched state, the assistant froze for a second and didn't dare argue. Julian washed himself quickly and changed into clean clothes. The man in the mirror was pale and gaunt, but his eyes were unusually calm. He grabbed only his essential ID documents and headed downstairs. The assistant couldn't help but ask, "Mr. Julian, aren't you going to pack any luggage?" "No need," Julian replied blankly. "I'll buy whatever I need when I get there, and you don't need to drive me. I already called a car." Right before getting into his ride, he turned to look at the assistant. "Please pass a message to my sister for me. Tell her I will be perfectly obedient. Just as she wishes, I will keep my distance from her from now on." He paused. "And wish her a happy engagement for me." The car door shut, and the vehicle slowly rolled away from the Vance estate. Only after they had driven out of the gated community did the driver speak. "Mr. Vance, the Sterling family sent me to take you to the airport. We'll fly straight to London, and you'll attend the wedding right after landing. Everything is prepared." Julian leaned against the window, watching the city skyline blur past him. This city, where he had lived for 20 years, the place where Victoria was slowly fading into the distance. He offered a soft MHM. From now on, there would be oceans and mountains between them. They would never see each other again. The engagement party was held at a 7-star hotel owned by the Vance family. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead, and the room was an ocean of roses. Tristan Thorne, dressed in a pristine white tuxedo, held Victoria's hand, smiling radiantly as he accepted the guests' blessings. He tilted his head slightly, showing off his sharp profile. Chapter 4. Victoria looked down at him, but for some inexplicable reason, she remembered Julian many years ago. When Julian was just a boy, he had looked up at her with eyes shining like captured stars and said, "When I grow up, I'm going to marry you, Victoria. Back then, she had laughed and ruffled his hair, telling him it was just childish nonsense, though deep down she found her little brother incredibly endearing. In a sudden daze, she thought she saw Julian standing at the end of the red carpet. He was wearing a gorgeous suit, walking toward her step by step. His eyes were brimming with hope and sheer joy, his lips slightly parted as if he were about to call her name. Victoria's heart violently seized. Victoria! Tristan's voice yanked her back to reality. The end of the red carpet was entirely empty, save for waiters weaving through the crowd with trays of champagne. There was no Julian. She rubbed her temples, convincing herself she was just exhausted from the past few days. Suddenly, the roar of a jet engine tearing through the sky drifted in from the windows. She looked up and saw a plane heading south. Its silver-white wings caught the blinding glare of the sun, trailing a long streak of white vapor that slowly dissolved into the boundless blue sky. An unexplainable wave of deep anxiety washed over her. Victoria! Tristan tugged at her sleeve again. It's time to go toast the guests. Victoria pulled her gaze away, suppressed the strange feeling in her chest, and nodded. The entire day was a blur of clinking glasses. Lifelong family friends, the Thorne relatives, corporate partners, smiling face after smiling face approached her, and glass after glass of liquor slid down her throat. Victoria had a high tolerance, but today she drank an unusually heavy amount. Tristan stayed by her side the entire time, effortlessly charming the socialite wives and occasionally glancing up at her with a sickeningly sweet gaze. It wasn't until late into the night, when the guests had finally dispersed, that the banquet hall returned to silence. Victoria sat on the sofa in the VIP lounge, loosening her collar. After a moment of thought, she finally dialed her assistant's number. Is everything settled with Julian? The assistant's voice came through quickly. Miss Victoria, Mr. Julian went to Milwaukee just as you requested. I watched him get in the car myself. Why didn't you drive him there yourself? Forget it. Did he say anything? The assistant paused. He asked me to give you a message. He said he would be perfectly obedient. Just as you wished. He will keep his distance from you from now on. Oh. And he wished you a happy engagement. Victoria's grip on her phone tightened. Keep his distance. Coming from Julian, those words felt profoundly wrong. In the past, he wished he could glue himself to her 24 hours a day. Even when she went on business trips, he would bombard her with video calls. Now, he was voluntarily saying he would keep his distance. She frowned, about to call Julian directly to demand an explanation, when Tristan returned, having changed into a sharp crimson suit. He sat down next to her, wrapping an arm around hers, his voice soft. Calling Julian? Didn't he leave for Milwaukee today? Victoria sounded hesitant. He didn't make a fuss at all. He even said he'd keep his distance from me going forward. I'm a little worried. Tristan's smile never wavered. He rested his head on her shoulder, his tone laced with calculated indifference. Don't worry about it. He's just throwing a tantrum because you disciplined him. Saying he'll keep his distance is just him acting out. Give it a few days. Once he cools off, he'll be running right back to cling to you. He looked up at her, his eyes shining. You know how he is? Hasn't he been exactly like this since he was a kid? Just give him the cold shoulder for a few days. He'll be fine. Victoria thought about it, and it seemed he was right. Whenever Julian threw a tantrum, it was always loud thunder, but no rain. Within a few days, he would inevitably crawl back, acting sweet and apologizing. Saying, Victoria, I was wrong. This time the fight was just a bit bigger than usual, but fundamentally, nothing had changed. Maybe this was a good opportunity to leave him out in the cold, so he'd finally learn to behave. She set her phone down. Tristan's lips curled into a smirk. He leaned close to her ear, his voice smooth as silk. The night is short. Let's not waste it on annoying thoughts. The scent of his cologne wafted over her, his warm breath grazing her ear. Victoria turned her head to look at him. That flawlessly sculpted face was overflowing with tender affection. She pulled him in by the waist and leaned down to kiss him. For the first month after the engagement, Victoria spent all her time keeping Tristan company. They traveled to Northern Europe, skiing in Norway, exploring small towns in Sweden, and chasing the northern lights in Iceland. Tristan was in high spirits, packing their itinerary from dawn to dusk. Victoria thought about contacting Julian several times, but every single attempt was coincidentally interrupted by Tristan with one excuse or another, leaving her no choice but to drop it. Until the day the northern lights finally peaked. The night sky was flooded with ribbons of green and violet, so breathtaking it felt unreal. While Tristan stood beside her, head tilted back in awe, Victoria involuntarily found herself thinking back to 3 years ago, when she and Julian had come to Iceland. Under these exact same auroras, the way Julian had looked at her was infinitely more dazzling than the lights above. Later, when Tristan had stolen his first place spot in the photography competition, Julian had been depressed and furious. She had coaxed him, promising to bring him back to Iceland for another photography trip. Julian had held out his pinky finger, and she had smiled, locking her pinky with his. But that was a promise she had never kept. That day, claiming exhaustion, Victoria headed back to the hotel early with Tristan. The truth was, she had been having disjointed dreams over the past month. Upon waking, she could never remember the details, but the suffocating feelings of regret, sorrow, and remorse lingered, refusing to fade. And that night, she finally had a complete dream. In the dream, Victoria found herself standing in a hospital morgue. A worker pulled back a white sheet, revealing Julian's face. He was deathly pale, freezing cold, his eyes shut tight. She froze, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't lift them. The scene shifted to the Vance family living room. Her mother sat on the sofa, her eyes swollen, muttering to herself. It wasn't really Julian's fault. He just wanted to be with the person he loved. What was so wrong with that? I was the one who supported him. I encouraged him to chase you. But when everything went wrong, I threw all the blame onto him. He was always so sweet. He was my good boy. When I was sick, he stayed up all night by my bed. Every week, he went out his way to buy the pastries I liked. Every year on my birthday, he made me a gift by hand. Her mother covered her face and began to sob. But I only remembered all of this after he died. I hated him for so long, but the person I really hated was myself. The scene shifted again. She was sitting alone in her study, her mind flooded with memories of the past. 3-year-old Julian, huddled in the corner of the orphanage, looking at her with terrified eyes. She handed him a piece of candy. His eyes lit up, and he whispered, "Thank you, Victoria." 8-year-old Julian burning with a fever. She sat by his bed all night. In a delirious daze, he grabbed her hand and begged, "Victoria, don't go." She told him she wouldn't go anywhere. His big sister was right there. 12-year-old Julian cornered by thugs in an alley. She charged in and fought them off. He threw himself into her arms, crying, and she patted his back, saying, "Don't be afraid. I'll protect you." 16-year-old Julian wearing a tailored suit for the first time, walking down the stairs. Looking so handsome, she couldn't take her eyes off him. Her heart gave a violent jolt, and she frantically told herself, He is your brother. Just your brother." Later, the way Julian looked at her grew more and more heated. Of course, she knew exactly what that look meant. She tried absolutely everything to stop herself from returning that gaze. She started dating other men, one after another, all while indulging Julian, as he acted like a territorial animal, chasing every single one of them away. Eventually, she got together with Tristan Thorne. He and Julian despised each other. Tristan was the perfect candidate to finally crush Julian's hopes. But every time Julian threw a fit, every time he cried, every time he ran to her to cling to her, she was secretly overjoyed. The day she finally relented and agreed to marry him, she pretended he had simply worn her down. Only Victoria herself knew the truth. Deep in her heart, she had wanted to surrender to the mistake. But then everything fell apart. Her father died. Her mother hated Julian. She couldn't bear to look at Julian's guilt-ridden, broken state, so she hid. She buried herself in corporate work, in social events, and in Tristan's comforting embrace. But while she avoided him, in that massive, empty mansion, Julian withered and fell into a deeper depression with every passing day. So, she brought up divorce. She figured that after the divorce, they would just be siblings again. She could be good to him without any guilt. She could protect him just like when they were little. But before she had the chance to make amends, Julian died. The scene shifted one more time. She was standing outside Tristan's apartment door. It was left ajar, and illicit noises spilled out into the hallway. She pushed the door open to find him rolling around in bed with another woman. Tristan panicked, rushing over to explain, but she coldly slapped his hand away and walked out. She had thrown her own brother away for a piece of trash. The final image. 1 year later, on the anniversary of Julian's death, she stood at the intersection where he had been killed, holding a bouquet of white roses. Watching the endless stream of traffic, she suddenly remembered him holding her hand as a child, saying, "Victoria, you have to stay with me forever." She had said okay, but she didn't keep her word. A cargo truck came barreling toward her. She didn't dodge. Victoria's eyes snapped open. The phantom impact of the truck still reverberated through her bones, hurting so much she could barely breathe. It made her realize with horrifying clarity that this hadn't been a simple dream. It felt like the visceral memory of a past life that had genuinely happened. Chapter 5. She grabbed her phone and immediately dialed Julian's number. Powered off. She dialed again. Still off. She called the executive in charge of the Milwaukee subsidiary. How was Julian adjusting at the company? Where is his apartment? The executive's voice was groggy with sleep. Ms. Vance? Mr. Julian never showed up to report for work. I assumed he just wanted to take a few extra days off. Victoria's heart plummeted. Say that again. He never came to the subsidiary. Victoria hung up aggressively and booked the earliest flight back to the U.S. The moment she arrived in Chicago, she went straight to Eleanor. Mom, do you know where Julian went? Julian? Didn't you send him to Milwaukee to take over the subsidiary? Eleanor frowned, her tone perfectly calm as she redirected the question. Victoria Prestjarde. The subsidiary said he never reported in. Mom, where's Julian? There's no way you don't know. Don't try to play dumb with me. Eleanor paused for a second, a spark of anger finally bleeding into her voice. You get engaged to another man, and you let outsiders bully him like that. Julian was heartbroken, so he went traveling abroad to clear his head. Why do you suddenly care? Hearing the evasiveness hidden beneath her mother's anger, Victoria took a deep breath. Fina, if you won't tell me, I'll find out myself. I won't disturb your rest. But Victoria never expected that even if she turned the entire city of Chicago upside down, she wouldn't find a single trace of Julian Vance. He was like a ghost. There were no outbound flight records under his name, no credit card transactions, no one who had seen him, until she was walking past the corporate pantry and overheard several female employees gossiping. Did you see the leak from that London gossip blog? The second heiress of the Sterling family got married. Morgan Sterling? That psychopath? What rich heir actually had the guts to marry her? They say he's American. Someone managed to snap a blurry side profile. He's actually really handsome. Someone online pointed out he looks exactly like the youngest son of the Vance family. Victoria stopped dead in her tracks. She walked over, her voice tight. What photo? Startled, the employee fumbled with her phone and handed it over. The photo was blurry, obviously taken covertly. At the wedding venue, the groom stood in a sharp tuxedo, facing slightly away from the camera. Only a fraction of his face was visible. But Victoria recognized him instantly. It was Julian. The hand holding the phone began to shake violently. The Sterling family. London. A wedding. The date was the exact same day she had her engagement party with Tristan. She rushed home, stormed up to her mother, and shoved the phone in her face. This is Julian, isn't it? Eleanor took one look, went silent for a long time, and finally nodded. Julian said he wanted to use an arranged marriage to repay the Vance family for raising him. Her mother said softly, he begged me to keep it from you. He was terrified it would ruin your relationship with Tristan. It felt like a bomb went off in Victoria's brain. To repay his debt to the family? Afraid of ruining her engagement? So Julian went and married a woman rumored to be a violent, deranged psychopath, throwing the rest of his life into hell. She spun on her heel and marched toward the door. Eleanor grabbed her arm. Where are you going? London. I'm bringing Julian back. Just then, the heavy front doors of the mansion were pushed open from the outside. Tristan Thorne stood in the doorway, his eyes red. Behind him, two servants carried his luggage. Victoria, I was so worried about you. I took the next flight back. He stepped forward, trying to grab her hand. I heard about Julian. His marriage to Morgan Sterling was his own choice. You. Victoria dodged his hand. Tristan froze, forcing a strained smile. Are you just exhausted? Don't be like this. Let's go inside and get some rest. We can talk about Julian later. Talk about it later? Victoria stared at him, her eyes as cold as ice. He is my brother. I know he's your brother. Tristan softened his tone. But do you know who the Sterlings are? If you storm over there trying to snatch him back, what happens to the Vance family's reputation? What happens to our engagement? He paused, letting a hint of grievance bleed into his voice. Besides, since Julian chose to get married, it means he finally thought things through. He's always had an inappropriate obsession with you. You know that. Now that he's willing to let go and start a new life, shouldn't you, as a sister, be happy for him? Why do you have to go interfere with his life? Victoria stared at him, then let out a chilling laugh. Tristan Thorne, when you were living abroad, all those years, exactly how many girlfriends did you have? Tristan's face changed instantly. Do you need me to list them one by one? Victoria said flatly. Or would you prefer I read their names directly to your parents? Tristan took a step back. His lips moved, but no sound came out. The engagement is off. Victoria walked past him. Don't ever show your face to me again. Tristan spun around, his voice turning sharp and hysterical. Victoria Vance, you're doing this to me over Julian? He is your brother. Your siblings. Wake the hell up. Victoria stopped walking and looked back at him. Her gaze was so devoid of warmth, it sent a violent shiver down his spine. Whether I'm awake or not, it's not your place to teach me. Sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Julian lay in bed, staring at the intricate crown molding on the ceiling. It took him a long time to process it all. It finally clicked that he was in the Sterling family's ancestral chateau in France. The wedding 3 days ago still felt like a bizarre dream. After landing in London, he had been escorted by Sterling personnel to a mansion in an exclusive enclave. An army of stylists and makeup artists had descended on him, dressing him up to perfection like a prize doll. At the wedding, dressed in a white tuxedo and holding a bouquet of white roses, he had walked down the impossibly long red carpet. Standing at the end of the aisle was a young woman with a tall, elegant figure. Her features were so exquisite, she looked like a painting. That was Morgan Sterling. The rumored dark, violent psychopath actually possessed an incredibly clean, ethereal beauty. She wore a black, trailing wedding gown. There was even something vaguely familiar about her eyes, though he couldn't put his finger on it. But before he had time to think, he was already standing in front of her. The wedding was grand and majestic. Every detail was opulent and refined to the extreme, yet there were surprisingly few guests in attendance. Morgan conducted herself with absolute elegance and grace, though she always maintained a faint, polite distance from him. They exchanged rings and took their vows before the priest, just like any other newlyweds. That night, Morgan had someone deliver their marriage certificate, along with a late-night meal, a change of clothes, and his preferred toiletries. "Get some rest, Mr. Vance." She stood in the doorway, her tone entirely neutral. "I'll be in the next room. If you need anything, call for a servant." When the door closed, Julian stared at the neat pile of items on the table and suddenly exhaled a massive sigh of relief. Laying in bed, staring at the ceiling, he realized this marriage was infinitely better than he had imagined. The next day, Morgan took him on a flight to France. For the 12-hour flight, they sat in the same private jet, but barely exchanged 3 sentences. Morgan spent the entire time reading documents and occasionally taking calls in fluent French, which he couldn't understand. Julian leaned against the window, zoning out at the clouds. When the plane landed, he saw a massive medieval chateau standing deep within an estate, surrounded by endless rolling vineyards. Morgan said, "You'll live here from now on." Julian nodded and followed her out of the car. The chateau was impossibly large, swarming with staff, yet Morgan rarely made an appearance. She handed him over to the head butler, said, "Take good care of my husband," and vanished. Over the next few days, Julian slowly realized that everything about this place was bizarre. The walk-in closet was stocked with the latest seasonal collections, exclusively from his favorite designers. The study featured an entire wall of books related to film production, including rare, out-of-print editions he had always wanted but could never find. When afternoon tea was served, the pastries tasted exactly like the ones from the historic bakery he had loved since childhood in Chicago. He asked the butler, "Who prepared all of this?" The butler smiled professionally. "The young miss ordered it. She specifically asked us to arrange everything to your exact preferences." Julian was stunned. "How does she know what I like?" The butler didn't answer, merely bowing slightly and stepping away. He stood by the window, gazing out at the unfamiliar estate. The sunlight bathed the grapevines, and a few birds drifted across the open sky. He suddenly remembered the day he left Chicago. The assistant had asked if he was going to pack his luggage. He had casually replied that there was no need, that he would just buy whatever he needed when he got there. Now, he truly didn't need to buy a single thing. He didn't need to worry about anything at all, because someone had already arranged everything perfectly for him. That person was Morgan Sterling, his new wife. She kept a clear physical distance from him, yet she had curated every detail of his life with obsessive perfection. Julian had no idea why she was doing this. He only knew that Morgan was a walking enigma, steeped in a profound, intriguing mystery. The wind picked up outside, rustling the leaves of the vines. Julian pulled his gaze back into the room and let out a soft breath. Perhaps this arranged marriage wasn't nearly as terrifying as he had thought. A month passed. Julian gradually adapted to his new life in the Sterling family. Chapter 6. He woke up naturally every day, took walks around the sprawling estate, read in the massive library, and enjoyed afternoon tea in the gardens. His days were peaceful and comfortable, soothing the constant anxiety that had plagued him since his rebirth. Morgan remained as elusive as a ghost. Sometimes he wouldn't see her for days. When they occasionally bumped into each other in the dining hall, it was merely a polite nod and an exchange of fewer than 3 sentences. He didn't pry, and she didn't explain. They lived like 2 strangers sharing a massive roof. That was until late one night, when Julian was jolted awake by a commotion downstairs. He threw on a robe and opened his bedroom door. From the end of the hallway, he could hear the suppressed, panicked gasps of the servants. His heart skipped a beat, and he hurried down the stairs. The main living room was flooded with blinding light. 2 bodyguards were practically carrying Morgan inside. She was covered in blood. Her white silk blouse was more than half soaked in crimson. They laid her gently onto the sofa. Looking up and seeing him, one of the guards faltered. "Sir." Julian took a deep breath, forcing his legs to move forward. Only when he got close did he see the true extent of the damage. There were multiple gashes on her body. The longest one ran down her arm. The flesh was split open, still seeping dark blood. Her face was ashen, practically translucent, and her lips were entirely devoid of color. He whipped his head toward a terrified servant. "Get the medical kit. Hot water, clean towels. Now." The servant snapped out of their trance and sprinted away. Julian knelt beside the sofa, reaching out to press the back of his hand against Morgan's forehead. It was freezing cold and slick with sweat. Sensing the touch, Morgan's eyelashes fluttered. She forced her eyes open with agonizing effort. When she saw him, her gaze lost focus for a fraction of a second. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. "Don't speak." Julian gently pressed down on her uninjured hand as she tried to lift it. "I'm going to clean your wounds." The medical kit arrived. He snapped it open, pulling out the rubbing alcohol, gauze, and coagulant powder one by one. One of the bodyguards tried to intervene. "Sir, please let me handle this." "No." Julian cracked open the seal on the alcohol bottle, soaked a cotton ball, and began meticulously cleaning the gaping wound on Morgan's arm. His hands were trembling slightly, but his movements never stopped. The moment the soaked cotton touched the torn edge of the flesh, Morgan's entire body seized in a violent flinch. He looked up at her. She had her jaw clamped shut, the veins bulging on her forehead, yet she refused to let out a single sound. "If it hurts, make a sound," he said. Morgan looked back at him, pulling her lips into a weak ghost of a smile. She still didn't speak. Julian lowered his head and continued cleaning, disinfecting, applying the powder, wrapping the bandages. His movements were amateurish, but he executed every step with absolute focus. After finishing with her arm, he realized there were other wounds. Her ribs were covered in dark, ugly bruising, and a few lacerations crisscrossed her back. He helped her roll on her side, carefully tending to the smaller cuts. Through it all, Morgan remained completely silent. The only sign of life was the subtle tensing of her muscles whenever he brushed against a particularly painful spot. He didn't know how much time passed before the final wound was dressed. Setting the tweezers down, Julian finally realized his own palms were drenched in sweat. He tried to stand up to go wash his hands, but his wrist was suddenly caught in a vice grip. Morgan had opened her eyes again. Her consciousness seemed to be fading, her gaze unfocused, but she gripped his hand like a vice, squeezing so hard it felt like she might crush his bones. "Don't go," she muttered. Her voice was shredded and hoarse, rendering her as fragile as a lost child. Julian froze. He looked down at her. Her face was chalk white, her brows knit tight in agony, her lips pressed into a thin line. The hand gripping his was trembling violently, like a drowning victim clutching the last piece of driftwood. Somewhere deep in his chest, something suddenly softened. Julian sat back down on the edge of the sofa. He didn't pull his hand away. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Go to sleep." Morgan seemed to understand. The crushing grip on his hand loosened slightly, but she didn't let go. She closed her eyes, and her breathing gradually leveled out. Julian leaned against the armrest, staring at her peaceful, sleeping face. It truly was a beautiful face. Elegant brows, a sharp, high-bridged nose. In sleep, she lacked any trace of the predatory aggression she usually carried. She actually looked remarkably gentle. He thought about the words she had just mumbled. "Don't go." It reminded him of so many years ago when he was burning with a fever, clutching Victoria's hand and begging, "Victoria, don't go." Julian lowered his eyes, cutting off the thought. He sat there just like that, letting her hold his hand, keeping watch over her for the entire night. When the sky outside finally began to lighten, Julian drifted into an exhausted sleep. When he woke up, he found himself lying in a proper bed. Morgan was sitting on the edge of the mattress. She had changed into clean clothes. Though she was still terribly pale, she looked much better. She was staring at him unblinkingly, her gaze burning with an alarming intensity. Seeing him open his eyes, she smiled. Her voice was low and resonant, like a cello. "Thank you for last night, Julian." Julian felt a sudden flush of heat creep up his ears. He shook his head. "It was nothing." Morgan let out a soft, low chuckle. She stood up, walked to the bedroom door, and then turned back. "From now on, I will come home for dinner every night." The door clicked shut. Julian lay there, stunned for a long time. From that night on, Morgan made good on her word. She came home every single evening to keep him company. Dinner was served punctually in the dining room. Afterward, they would walk through the gardens together. When the night grew late, they shared the same bed. She never crossed the line. Every single time, she would quietly ask, "May I?" Only when Julian said yes would she finally lie down beside him. Days flowed by in this warm, quietly intimate routine. Julian gradually grew used to having someone by his side. He grew used to seeing Morgan sitting across from him at breakfast, and he grew used to hearing her say good night before he fell asleep. On a night when the moonlight was particularly bright, the two of them shared some wine, and the conversation drifted to the terrifying rumors surrounding her. Julian had been slightly nervous to bring it up, but Morgan was unexpectedly candid. A dark, violent psychopath. Inherited my mother's severe mental illness. Killed off my two older sisters. She listed the rumors one by one. Her tone is detached, as if she were reciting a grocery list. That's what the outside world says about me, isn't it? Julian didn't say anything. Morgan continued, her voice dropping lower. When I was 10, I watched my mother get murdered right in front of me. The killer was a servant who had worked for the Sterling family for 15 years. My mother trusted him implicitly, but he struck while she was taking an afternoon nap. One knife to the heart. Dead instantly. Julian's breath hitched. He was bribed. Someone wanted to cripple my father, and they used my mother to send the message. Later, my two older sisters died as well. The eldest in a car crash. The second from a horse-riding accident. Both ruled as tragedies. Both were actually assassinations. Morgan closed her eyes. My father was terrified I would be next. He told the world I inherited my mother's madness and locked me in a private asylum for my own safety. It wasn't until my father survived an assassination attempt by the skin of his teeth that I was forced to take over the family. I used a rain of iron and blood to purge our enemies and cement my position as the head of the house. So, most of those things you heard, they're true. Morgan opened her eyes, turning her head to look at him. A dry, self-deprecating smile touched her lips. I really have killed people, and I really did lose my mind for a while. Julian looked into her eyes. They were pitch black, so impossibly deep, like a bottomless lake. He was silent for a long time before finally asking, "Then why are you so good to me?" The look in Morgan's eyes shifted. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her body fully toward him. The space between them closed to less than an arm's length. "Because you saved my life," she said. Julian was stunned. "When I was 15, I escaped from the asylum. Men were hunting me. I fled all the way to Chicago and ducked into a dark alleyway." She stared directly into his soul. There was a pile of trash and broken crates near the entrance. I hid behind it. A few minutes later, men in black suits swarmed the alley, searching door to door. Just then, a little boy ran over. He stood right in front of that trash pile and pointed down the street, telling the men in suits that someone in black clothes had just sprinted that way. The corners of Morgan's lips curved upward. The men asked if he had seen me. He lied to their faces, told them no, and told them to get out of his way because they were blocking him from buying ice cream from the truck. He even warned them his bodyguards were right around the corner. Julian's eyes went wide. The men left. He reached behind the crates, hauled me out, and shoved a bottle of water into my hands. Morgan kept her gaze locked on him. He told me, "You're bleeding? Wash it off." I asked him his name so I could repay him someday. He told me not to worry about it, and then he ran away. The memory hit Julian like a freight train. That year, he had snuck out to buy snacks. In an alley, he bumped into a teenager covered in blood. He had lied to get rid of the men chasing her, shoved a water bottle at her, and bolted. He had never seen her again. "It was you," he blurted out. Morgan smiled. This smile was different from her usual composed demeanor. It was youthful, bright, and genuinely happy. "I've been keeping an eye on you in secret all these years. I found out you were adopted by the Vance family. But they treated you so well, and you only ever had eyes for your older sister." She paused, her eyes darkening slightly. Julian lowered his gaze. "It wasn't until I heard your sister was getting engaged," Morgan's voice softened to a whisper, "that I formally extended the marriage alliance to the Vance family." She suddenly reached out and grabbed Julian's hand. "Julian, since you agreed to marry me, don't ever think about leaving me in this lifetime." Chapter 7. She stared dead into his eyes, enunciating every single word. "Even if it kills me, I will never let you go." Julian looked back into her eyes. They were endlessly deep, obsidian black. Inside them, he saw a deadly earnestness he could perfectly understand, alongside an intensity he couldn't quite fathom. Yet, the emotion swelling in his chest wasn't fear. It was an unprecedented, overwhelming sense of safety. He gripped her hand back. He didn't say a word. Morgan froze for a second. Then her eyes curved into a genuine, radiant smile. That night, the distance between them vanished completely. She wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her chin on his shoulder, her breathing steady. Julian listened to the steady thumping of her heartbeat. One beat, then another. The news of Tristan Thorne's canceled engagement spread like wildfire through their elite circles. The Thorne family felt so utterly humiliated that they locked Tristan in the house, forbidding him from stepping outside. He smashed everything in his room, his fingernails digging so hard into his palms that they drew blood. It was all Julian. That bastard was already married, yet he still insisted on ruining Tristan's life, calling in every favor from his shady past connections. Tristan managed to reach out to the Sterling family's European rivals. He leaked everything: Julian's exact location, his daily routines, his schedule, and his favorite stores in town. He even hired someone to digitally alter photos, creating a dossier proving Julian had engaged in an incestuous affair with Victoria before his wedding, and had it sent anonymously to Morgan. When that gift arrived, Julian was in the study with Morgan, helping her review documents. Morgan clicked open the email, glanced at the contents, and her expression shifted slightly. Sensing her gaze fixed heavily on him, Julian looked up. "What's wrong?" Morgan didn't answer. She simply turned the laptop screen toward him. Seeing the contents, the blood in Julian's veins turned to ice. It was a collection of photos of him and Victoria. Some were real, taken out of context. Others were vile, highly manipulated fakes. The attached text was repulsive, claiming he had been sleeping with his sister right up until his wedding, painting him as a morally bankrupt seducer. He opened his mouth, desperately wanting to explain, but found his throat completely restricted. Morgan watched him. Suddenly, she let out a short laugh, moved her mouse, and permanently deleted the email into the digital void. "I knew all about the history between you and your sister long ago, but that is the past. You are my husband now, and I trust you." Julian was stunned into silence. Morgan looked at him, her gaze cool but undeniably sincere. "You saved my life. I investigated you for 8 years. I know exactly what kind of man you are, better than you know yourself." Tears pricked Julian's eyes. He put his book down, walked over to her, and for the very first time, initiated a hug. Morgan's body went completely rigid for a split second before she wrapped her arms tightly around his waist, pulling him flush against her. She buried her face in his shoulder, not saying a word, only tightening her iron grip on him. The sunlight poured in from the windows. The two of them just held each other like that, refusing to let go. A few days later, Julian headed into the nearby town to visit a bookstore. It was a weekly routine. He'd buy some new releases and stroll through the town. Morgan always sent a driver and bodyguards with him, so he never felt anything was out of the ordinary. Halfway down the road, their vehicle was suddenly forced to a screeching halt by several black SUVs. The bodyguards reacted instantly, throwing the car into reverse to maneuver and escape. But there were too many attackers. Over a dozen men wielding steel pipes and bats surrounded the car. Julian's palms were slick with sweat, but he forced himself to stay calm. Just as the thugs raised their weapons to smash the windows, another group of men swarmed out of nowhere. It was Morgan's elite security team. They ambushed the attackers from behind. Their movements were brutal and ruthlessly efficient. Within minutes, all dozen thugs were pinned face down against the asphalt. Watching the scene unfold, Julian's heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape his chest. The car door was yanked open. Morgan stood outside, her face a mask of terrifying, murderous rage. She reached in, practically dragging him out of the car, her eyes scanning him frantically from head to toe. "Are you hurt?" Julian shook his head. Only then did Morgan let out a ragged breath, yanking him into her arms. Her grip was punishingly tight, squeezing him so hard almost hurt, but he didn't make a sound. On the ride back, Morgan was on the phone the entire time. Listening to snippets of the conversation, Julian realized she was already interrogating the attackers. Who sent them? What were their orders? Who was pulling the strings? By the time they reached the chateau, the sun had set. Morgan escorted Julian into his bedroom. "Get some rest early tonight. I have some business to handle." Julian caught her sleeve. "Who was it?" Morgan was silent for 2 seconds. "Tristan Thorne. He contacted one of the Sterling family's rivals. They wanted to kidnap you to blackmail me." Julian's heart sank. Morgan looked at him, reaching out to gently stroke his hair. Her touch was feather-light. "Don't worry," she said. "He touched what is mine. I will make sure he learns the true price of that mistake." She turned to leave, stopping once more at the door to look back. "Take a heavier security detail from now on. This was my oversight." The door closed. Julian sat on the edge of the bed. Flashbacks of the violent thugs swarming the car made his fingers tremble slightly. But beneath the adrenaline, he felt something else entirely. Absolute security. He knew, with complete certainty, that there was someone in this world who would burn it all down to keep him safe. Victoria had intended to fly straight to London and drag Julian back, but domestic corporate fires had pinned her down in Chicago for a full half-month. Her father, Richard Vance, had personally marched into her office, slamming a mountain of files onto her desk. You want to fly to Europe to kidnap someone? Finish these first. The Vance corporate empire isn't a toy you can abandon just to fund your temper tantrums. Victoria pulled over a dozen all-nighters to finalize the massive backlog of projects. When her plane finally took off, she leaned her head against the window, her eyes completely bloodshot. It was a 14-hour flight, but she didn't sleep for a single minute. Her mind was entirely consumed by Julian, holding her hand as a child, whining and calling her Victoria. The final words he left her with, wishing her a happy engagement, and the agonizing visions from her dream. His chalk-white face, his freezing corpse, and the bloody intersection. She couldn't afford to lose him again. When the plane landed, Victoria chartered a car straight to the Sterling family chateau. The massive iron gates were bolted shut. Two men in black suits stood outside, their faces carved from stone. "I need to see Morgan Sterling," she demanded. One of the guards glanced at her. "Miss Sterling is not receiving guests. I'm looking for Julian Vance. He is my brother." The guard's expression didn't change a fraction of an inch. "Mr. Vance is not receiving guests." Victoria clenched her fists, standing outside the gates for a long time. She refused to give up. She found a spot near the gates and simply sat down to wait. The first day, no one paid her any attention. The guard swapped shifts twice, looking at her like she was a lunatic. The second day, it rained. She hadn't brought an umbrella, so she stood directly in the downpour. A guard walked over to check on her, then silently retreated to his post. The third day, the rain stopped. She leaned against the stone wall, her lips cracked and bleeding, but her eyes never left the massive doors. On the morning of the fourth day, the gates finally opened. Julian walked out. He was wearing a pristine white dress shirt. He looked incredibly healthy. There was even a faint, vibrant flush to his cheeks. With the morning sun cascading over him, he looked like an oil painting. Victoria froze. He looked so good, infinitely better than she had ever imagined. Julian walked up to her and stopped. He took in her wretched, exhausted appearance with mild surprise, but mostly with incomprehension. "Victoria, what are you doing here?" His tone was polite, yet impossibly distant. Victoria's throat constricted. When she finally spoke, her voice was so raspy she didn't even recognize it. "Julian, Morgan Sterling is a dangerous woman. I can't take you home." Julian said nothing. She took a step forward, desperately reaching out to grab his hand, but the bodyguard instantly stepped between them, blocking her path. "I know I was wrong." Victoria ignored the guard, staring desperately into Julian's eyes. "I never should have doubted you. I shouldn't have struck you. I shouldn't have locked you away. And I never should have divorced you." Julian froze. Then he smiled. The smile was faint, carrying a complex emotion that was impossible to read. "So, you were reborn too, Victoria?" Victoria's heart violently seized. Julian looked at her, his gaze as tranquil as a stagnant pool. "But it's too late." He took a step backward, putting even more physical distance between them. "I am Morgan Sterling's husband now," he said. "We made a vow. We will not be separated in this lifetime." Victoria opened her mouth to argue, but found her throat completely paralyzed. Julian turned around and began walking back inside. Instinctively, she tried to run after him, but the guard formed an immovable wall. "Julian!" She screamed his name, her voice tearing. Julian's footsteps paused, but he didn't turn around. "Go back, Victoria." His voice drifted over his shoulder. "Whatever was between us ended a long time ago." He walked through the massive iron gates, vanishing from her sight. Victoria stood rooted to the pavement, watching the gates slowly rumble shut. The sun was shining brightly. A light breeze swept past. She suddenly collapsed to a squat, burying her face in her hands. Chapter 8. Victoria still refused to leave. She stayed stranded in France, renting a small apartment in the nearby town. Every morning, she went to the chateau gates to wait. Every evening, she had a letter delivered inside. The first letter detailed the agonizing regret of her past life. It described her total mental collapse after his death, and how her mind was completely consumed by him when she stood at that fatal intersection. The second letter confessed the cowardice of her current life. It detailed how she had actually fallen in love with him long ago, but lacked the courage to admit it, and the agonizing pain that tore through her chest when she forced him toward other women. The third letter recounted all his virtues. It described the timid 3-year-old boy calling her Victoria, and the breathtaking 16-year-old walking down the stairs who made it impossible for her to look away. A fourth letter, a fifth, a sixth. Julian didn't reply to a single one. The guards at the gate transitioned from high alert to ignoring her, and finally to a state of helpless resignation. They watched this miserable, ruined executive show up exactly on time every day, handing over a letter like she was performing some sacred religious ritual. Half a month later, Julian finally agreed to see her. They met in the chateau's garden. White wrought iron patio furniture, a pot of black tea, 2 plates of pastries. Sunlight filtered through the grapevines, scattering broken gold across the ground. Julian sat across from her in a simple beige shirt. He looked even healthier than their last meeting, his face radiating a relaxed, vibrant energy she hadn't seen in years. He broke the silence, his tone entirely casual. "Whatever you've been trying to say to me, Victoria, just say it now." Victoria's throat tightened. 1,000 words clogged her chest, but in the end, they only formed one sentence. "Julian, come home with me." Julian looked at her and suddenly smiled. This smile was different from the last time. The last time he was distant. This time he was utterly cold. "Do you really not get it yet?" He picked up his teacup and took a slow sip. "I'm not throwing a tantrum. I'm not playing hard to get. I genuinely do not want to go back." Victoria opened her mouth, but no words came out. "You say you love me." Julian set the cup down, staring directly into her eyes. "Then let me ask you a few questions. Victoria Nadith, forget our past life. Let's talk about this one." He enunciated every syllable. "Why did you try to shove me onto Chloe Carmichael?" Victoria's chest seized. "Did you even know what kind of person she was? Tristan said she was a good match, and you didn't even bother doing a basic background check. You just tossed me to her. When we were younger, if the class president or the most popular girl in school even looked at me, you deemed them unworthy and forbade them from coming within 10 feet of me." Victoria desperately wanted to defend herself, but realized there was absolutely no excuse she could offer. "Second question," Julian continued. "Chloe Carmichael drugged me. I managed to escape, came home, and tried to explain what happened. Did you believe me?" Victoria felt like she was suffocating. "You didn't." Julian answered for her. "You didn't even try to investigate. You immediately assumed I was the one causing trouble. I wasn't afraid of talking to the police. But to sweep it under the rug and appease the Carmichaels, you punished me with family discipline." He paused. "Third question." Julian held her gaze, looking at her like she was a complete stranger. "You gave me 10 lashes with a riding crop and locked me in a pitch-black basement for 3 days. No doctor, no medicine, just sour bread and freezing water." The blood drained instantly from Victoria's face. "Do you have any idea how I survived those 3 days?" Julian's voice remained eerily calm. "The knife wound hadn't healed. The whip cuts got infected. The drugs in my system hadn't worn off. I was so delirious with fever, I pounded on the door until my palms bled, begging them to give me a single sip of water or a single pill. They told me it was your direct order, that I needed to suffer to learn my lesson." Victoria began to tremble violently. She didn't know. She truly, honestly hadn't known. Fourth question. Julian leaned back. "What exactly were you doing during those 3 days while I was locked away?" Victoria remembered the flashes from the timeline. She had been accompanying Tristan to his tuxedo fittings. She had been obsessing over the details of the engagement banquet. She had been listening to him complain that the roses weren't fresh enough. "You were planning your perfect engagement party," Julian said it for her. "Extravagant, meticulous, personally overseeing every minor detail, checking every invitation by hand. Custom gemstones, an ocean of roses." He allowed a short, bitter laugh. "The wedding I practically died to get in my past life. You treated the entire thing like an irritating chore. I didn't understand it back then, but I do now. It's not that you don't know how to be devoted. It's just that you never wanted to be devoted to me." Victoria's eyes burned red. Her voice was cracked and broken. "Julian, I was wrong. I was stupid. I was a coward. I'll do absolutely anything to make it up to you. Just please give me one more chance." Julian sat in silence for a very long time. The wind swept through the vines, the leaves rustling softly. He picked up his teacup, then slowly set it back down. "Victoria." When he said her name, his tone was impossibly light. "I won't forget how good you were to me growing up. So, from now on, I will only look at you as an older sister. I don't dare to love you anymore, and I don't want to love you anymore." Victoria felt like a knife had been twisted into her heart. "Just like you always wanted." Julian stood up. "We will be siblings forever. Go home." He turned and walked away. Victoria tried to chase after him, but her legs felt like they were nailed to the earth. She watched his figure walk further and further away, until he finally disappeared at the end of the garden. Victoria still didn't leave. She remained stranded in France, living out of the rented apartment in town. Every day, she managed her company's operations remotely. She rarely went outside. Mostly, she just stood by the window for hours. No one knew what was going through her mind, but she started making moves. She secretly launched a massive investigation into everything Tristan Thorn had done over the years. She tracked down witnesses, unearthed buried evidence, and dug up every rotting skeleton in his closet. A month later, she mailed a thick manila envelope to the chateau. The recipient was Morgan Sterling. Inside was the complete dossier of Tristan's crimes. How he had bribed Chloe Carmichael to drug Julian. How he had explicitly ordered the servants to deny Julian food, water, and medicine while he was locked in the basement. How he had contacted the Sterling family's rivals to leak Julian's location. 3 days later, Morgan sent someone to bring Victoria to her. They met at a quiet cafe in town. Morgan sat by the window in a heavy black trench coat. She looked paler than the rumors suggested, but her eyes were as sharp as surgical steel. Victoria sat down across from her. They stared at each other for several seconds. "I received your package," Morgan said, her voice completely flat. "What do you want?" Victoria shook her head. "I don't want anything." Morgan arched an eyebrow. "Julian is my brother," Victoria said. "If someone touches him, I will destroy them. But he has chosen you. I needed to see exactly how much you care about him." Morgan studied her for a long time before finally giving a slow nod. "I will handle Tristan Thorne." She stood up to leave, but stopped at the door, glancing back with a smile that bordered on genuinely wicked. "Victoria, I forgot to thank you for giving me the opportunity. Next time, I'll buy you that drink to celebrate the wedding you missed." The door shut, leaving a dark-faced Victoria sitting entirely alone, her coffee turning freezing cold. Tristan's downfall was apocalyptic and instantaneous. First, the Thorne corporate empire was investigated by federal authorities. Tax evasion, massive corporate fraud, a cascade of federal charges slammed into them. Tristan's father was dragged out in handcuffs. Their assets were frozen, and the company filed for bankruptcy overnight. Then came Tristan's personal reckoning. The atrocities he had committed over the years were dragged out into the blinding light of day, unleashing a tsunami of public outrage online, driving a classmate to suicide, framing Julian, hiring a hit squad to kidnap an elite heiress's husband. Any single charge was enough to bury him. The day he was formally expelled from the Thorne family, he didn't even have time to pack his designer luggage. Driven to the absolute brink, he bought a plane ticket in a desperate bid to flee the country and escape the fallout. He was intercepted by the FBI right at the airport terminal. "Mr. Tristan Thorne, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit kidnapping. You're coming with us." He thrashed, he screamed, he hollered that he was innocent. Nobody even blinked. Julian didn't attend the trial, but he heard about the aftermath. Morgan had personally paid a visit to the maximum security holding facility to see Tristan once. No one knew what was said inside that room, but they knew that shortly after Morgan walked out, Tristan was transferred to a high-security psychiatric ward. He lost his mind inside. He spent his days raving like a lunatic, sometimes screaming curses at Julian, wishing him a gruesome death, and other times violently sobbing and begging for mercy. When the news reached Victoria, she was in her apartment reviewing corporate reports. She set her pen down and walked over to the window. It had started snowing outside. It was the first snow of the year. At twilight, Victoria drove out to the chateau. She waited by the gates for a moment before they opened. Julian walked out, wrapped in a thick white puffer jacket, a heavy scarf pulled up to his chin. Seeing her standing there, he paused. "Victoria." Victoria pulled a sealed envelope from the pocket of her wool coat and handed it to him. "What's this?" "Half of the Vance family's corporate assets. I've transferred them into your name," she said. "The paperwork is already finalized. You just need to sign it." Julian opened the envelope, glanced at the documents, and looked up at her. "Why are you doing this?" "Because it's what you deserve." Victoria looked at him. "The Vance family raised you for 20 years, and you paid off that debt by giving up your freedom for an arranged marriage. From now on, the Vance family will always be your shield. If you ever want to come back, the door is open. If you don't, you never have to." Julian was quiet for a moment before slipping the envelope into his pocket. He looked at her. The emotion in his eyes was completely different now. There was no hatred. There was no resentment. There was only a quiet, faded gentleness. "Thank you, Victoria." Chapter 9. Victoria's throat restricted. She desperately wanted to say something, but found her voice completely gone. The snow was falling heavier now, gathering lightly on their shoulders. The gates behind Julian clicked open again. Morgan walked out holding an umbrella, stepping directly to his side and lifting it to shield him from the snow. She shot Victoria a brief, unreadable look, saying nothing, simply wrapping an arm securely around Julian's waist. Julian turned his head to look at her. Morgan leaned up on her tiptoes and pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. It was a light, incredibly natural gesture, as if they had done it 1,000 times before. Victoria stood frozen, watching them. The snow fell in her hair and settled onto her shoulders. She didn't move an inch. Morgan kept her arm around Julian, turning him back toward the chateau. As he reached the gates, Julian looked back over his shoulder at her one last time. That single glance carried so much weight. It held closure, gratitude, and a final, permanent goodbye. Then he walked inside, and the heavy iron gates slammed shut. Victoria stood entirely alone in the snow for a very long time. The snowflakes landed on her face, melting into cold water that tracked slowly down her cheeks. She finally understood. Some people, once you let them slip away, are gone for the rest of your life. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Julian found himself growing more and more accustomed to Morgan's presence. They had rapidly settled into the effortless, unspoken rhythm of an old married couple. Except for the fact that every night, the way Morgan looked at him grew hotter and more intense, as if she was barely restraining the urge to swallow him whole. Julian wasn't afraid, nor did he try to pull away. After all, Morgan spoiled him. She spoiled him with absolutely zero boundaries or principles. If he casually mentioned craving a specific brand of milk tea, the kitchen would be fully stocked with the imported ingredients by the very next morning. If he flipped through a magazine and mentioned wanting to see the Northern Lights, she would have her team drawing up flight itineraries that same night. If he lingered in the gardens a few minutes too long, she ordered outdoor heaters and a custom swing set installed under the grapevines immediately. Julian told her she was being ridiculous. Morgan would just smile. As long as you like it. So Julian stopped merely being a passive recipient of her world. He began actively participating in the Sterling family's affairs. He helped Morgan review contracts, offered strategic advice, and occasionally accompanied her to high-stakes corporate events. One particular event was a brutal business negotiation. The opposition was one of the Sterling family's oldest European rivals. On the surface, they were proposing a joint venture. In reality, they had laid a massive trap. The contract clauses were laced with legal landmines. One wrong step and the Sterlings would be hemorrhaging billions. Sitting next to Morgan, Julian flipped through the proposed contract. Suddenly, an echo for his past life flared in his mind. He remembered the impending financial crisis. He remembered the specific corporations that were destined to implode and the complex commercial fraud tactics that would later be exposed to the public. He had studied similar disaster cases back when he was working for the Vance family. He leaned into Morgan and whispered a few sentences directly into her ear. Morgan shot him a look, a flicker of genuine shock crossing her eyes. She flipped to the exact clauses he had mentioned, scanned them meticulously, and a slow, lethal smile curved her lips. During the negotiation that followed, she flawlessly dismantled a rival's trap without breaking a sweat, turning their own legal landmines back against them to force a devastating counter-checkmate. The opposing representatives' faces turned ashen, and they were ultimately strong-armed into signing a deal entirely on the Sterling's terms. On the drive back to the chateau, Morgan couldn't stop looking at him. The look in her eyes was entirely new. It burned with something he had never seen before. "How did you spot that?" she asked. Julian thought for a moment. "I analyzed similar case studies back when I was at the Vance Corporation. I just remembered a few red flags." Morgan didn't press the issue. She simply took his hand, lacing her fingers through his, and held on with a crushing grip. That night, for the very first time, Morgan poured herself a heavy glass of wine. Julian drank a little with her. The two of them sat on the balcony of the master's suite, overlooking the endless expanse of the vineyards. The moonlight was brilliant, the breeze was gentle, and the distant hum of crickets filled the air. Morgan suddenly turned her head to look at him. Her gaze was so violently hot it made Julian's heart skip a beat. "Julian!" She called his name softly. Julian didn't say a word. She leaned across the space between them and kissed him. It was a soft kiss, tasting of expensive red wine, carrying a hint of cautious, tentative exploration. Julian closed his eyes and reached up to wrap his arms around her neck. Morgan's breathing hitched, turning heavy. She picked him up, carried him into the bedroom, and laid him back onto the mattress. In the dark room, her eyes shone with an alarming intensity. Within that darkness, he could read the overwhelming desperation she had been holding back. "May I?" she asked. Her voice was ragged, strained to the breaking point with restraint. Julian looked up at her, and suddenly he smiled. He hooked his arms tighter around her neck, pulling her down to him. "What do you think?" The moonlight outside was flawless. The grape leaves rustled in the wind, sounding like a quiet song. Hours later, Morgan held him close, resting her chin on his shoulder. Their breathing had slowly leveled out, though their hearts were still racing. "Julian," she spoke into the darkness. "MHM, have I ever told you that I am completely, utterly in love with you?" Julian froze for a split second, then his eyes curved into a deep smile. "You just did." Morgan tightened her arms, pulling him even deeper into her chest. She pressed her lips to his forehead, her voice incredibly soft. "I love you." I have loved you for a very, very long time. I thank whatever God is out there that you actually became my husband." Julian didn't respond. He buried his face against her chest, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of her heart. The moonlight spilled beautifully across the floor. The crickets chirped outside the window. Holding her tight, he suddenly thought back on everything that had led him here. The agony of his past life, the suffering, the desperation, the endless pursuit of something he could never have. The desperate escape in this life, flying across the world. In this marriage, which had initially been nothing more than a transaction to repay a debt. He never could have imagined his life would end up here. But now that he was here, he didn't regret a single second of it. "Morgan," he finally spoke. I think I must have spent every last drop of luck I was allocated for this lifetime, just to meet you." Morgan didn't say a word. She just held him even tighter. The moonlight leaked through the gap in the heavy curtains, pooling on the bed. They fell asleep in each other's arms, tangled together like two ancient trees whose roots had irrevocably intertwined. Chapter 18. 1 year later. Morgan lay in the pristine bed of a private hospital in London. She was pale, but her eyes were impossibly bright. Julian sat in a chair pulled up right against the mattress. In his arms, he held two tiny, swaddled bundles. His posture was totally rigid, holding them as if they were the most fragile artifacts on Earth, terrified to make even the slightest movement. A boy and a girl. Twins. Morgan looked at him, unable to suppress a tired laugh. "Did you freeze?" Julian couldn't speak. Morgan looked down, staring at those two tiny, wrinkled red faces, and her eyes slowly welled with tears. Julian was stunned. He had never seen her like this. The ruthless head of a sterling family, the woman who commanded a global empire and stared down assassins without blinking, was now crying over two tiny babies, her eyes bloodshot with overwhelming emotion. "Morgan," he called out softly. Morgan looked up at him. There were tears shining in her eyes. She opened her mouth, but it took her a long time to force the words out. "Thank you." Her voice was so broken it didn't even sound like her. "Thank you, Julian, for giving me a real family." Julian felt a sharp ache behind his nose. He reached out with one hand to touch her face. She leaned into his palm, pressing it flush against her cheek. "You idiot," he said, his own voice cracking. Morgan pushed herself up slightly, pressing a feathery kiss to his lips. The two babies fell fast asleep in their arms, their tiny, rhythmic breaths rising and falling together. On the day of the twins' 1-month celebration, Eleanor and Richard Vance flew all the way to France to visit. Eleanor held her granddaughter, tearing up over and over again. Richard stood beside her, staring at the twins, entirely unable to hide the massive smile on his face. "They look exactly like Julian did when he was a baby," Eleanor said. "The eyes, the nose. Identical." Morgan laughed softly from the side. "You're absolutely right, Mom." Eleanor looked up at her, her eyes overflowing with gratitude. This daughter-in-law was a million times better than the terrifying rumors had claimed. Julian glanced around the room, eventually asking, "Did Victoria not come?" Eleanor paused for a second before answering. "Victoria is swamped at the company. She couldn't get away." Julian didn't push it. Eleanor pulled a velvet jewelry box from her designer bag and handed it to him. "She asked me to give this to you." Julian opened the box. Inside were two traditional gold baby bracelets, custom forged from pure gold with exquisite craftsmanship. Engraved onto the surface were the names of his two children. At the bottom of the box rested a folded letter. He pulled out the stationery and unfolded it. There was only a single line written inside. "Julian, I wish you a lifetime of happiness. I will always be your older sister." Julian stared at that line of text, lost in thought for a long time. Every single tangled knot of love, hatred, and obsession he had shared with Victoria across 2 entire lifetimes flashed through his mind in an instant. The 3-year-old girl handing him a piece of candy. The hand holding his when he was burning with a fever. The gifts she brought back for him after every single business trip. And the devastating cruelty, the freezing apathy, and the agonizing moments that had finally forced him to walk away. When he finally snapped back to reality, he folded the letter up and placed it back into the velvet box. Then he locked the box inside a drawer. Laughter drifted in from outside the window. He walked over and pushed the glass doors open. The sunlight in the garden was absolutely perfect. Morgan was sitting on the grass, holding both babies, one in her left arm, one in her right. She was awkwardly trying to make them laugh, while the twins babbled, reaching their chubby little hands up to grab at her face. Chapter 10. The golden sunlight cascaded over her, illuminating those two tiny faces. It was warm, radiant, and utterly perfect. Julian's lips curved into a smile. He walked out of the room, down the long corridor, and pushed open the heavy doors leading into the garden. Morgan looked up, saw him coming, and her eyes crinkled into a bright smile. "You're awake?" She naturally reached out her hand. Julian wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest as he looked down at their children. Seeing their father, the two babies babbled excitedly, waving their arms to be held. He laughed, scooped up his son, and pressed a kiss to his chubby cheek. Morgan, holding their daughter, leaned over and pressed a kiss to Julian's cheek as well. "What was that for?" he chuckled. "Because I wanted to," she replied without a hint of shame. The twins watched their parents and broke into a fit of giggles. Julian looked at the baby boy in his arms, then at the little girl in Morgan's arms, and finally, he lifted his eyes to look at Morgan herself. The sun was perfectly warm. The breeze was light. The leaves of the grapevines rustled softly in the wind. He suddenly realized that he truly must have spent every last drop of his luck to make it to this exact moment. The rest of their lives stretched out before them, long and unwritten. But true happiness was already entirely within his grasp. From then on, the years were quiet and beautiful, without another ripple.